I'd like to call to order this regular council meeting of the town of Saugeen Shores, and the first order of business is a declaration of pecuniary interest, and I'll remind every member of their responsibility to do so, and you can do so now or when it arises on the agenda. None declared. Then the next item is additions, deletions, or amendments to the agenda, and I have a motion that's been moved by Deputy Mayor Luke Charbonneau and seconded by Councillor Mike Myatt that the regular council agenda be amended to add a notice of motion, item 7.2. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. So the next item then is special and regular council, the adoption of minutes, and it's been moved by Councillor Rich and seconded by Deputy Mayor Charbonneau that council adopt the minutes of the special council meeting and the regular council meeting of September the 14th, 2015 as presented. The errors or omission with the minutes? None. All in favor? That's carried. Next is the Committee of the Whole minutes of September the 14th, 2015, and it's been moved by Councillor Renage, seconded by Vice Deputy Mayor Huber, that council note and file the Committee of the Whole minutes of September the 14th, 2015. Any comments, errors, omissions? All in favor? It's carried. The next item on the agenda then is an Environmental Services report of September the 14th, 2015. And it's been moved by Vice Deputy Mayor Huber, seconded by Councillor Grace, that Council of the Town of Saugeen Shores adopts the Environmental Services report dated September the 14th, 2015, recommending that staff be authorized to submit an expression of interest for the 2015 Small Communities Fund Saugeen Beach Road Sanitary and Road Reconstruction Project. Questions or comments? All in favor then? Opposed, if any? That is carried. The next item is a report of municipal officers or committees, and it's a report of the Recreation and Active Transportation Committee, and it's been moved by Councillor Madison, seconded by Councillor Mike Myatt, that Council of the Town of Saugeen Shores adopts the report of the Recreation and Active Transportation Committee dated September the 28th, 2015. Any questions, comments? All in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried. Next is a report of the Waterfront Ad Hoc Committee, and it's been moved by Councillor Mike Myatt, seconded by Councillor Don Madison, that Council of the Town of Saugeen Shores adopts the report of the Waterfront Ad Hoc Committee dated September the 28th, 2015. Any questions, comments? All in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Next item then is the Airport Committee, and it's been moved by Councillor Dave Myatt and seconded by Vice Deputy Mayor Huber. The Council of the Town of Saugeen Shores adopts the report of the Airport Committee dated September the 28th, 2015. Questions, comments? Vice Deputy Mayor Huber.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just curious to know, this is the first time we've seen something like this from the Airport Committee, and it's good, but the very limited amount of funding that they receive from us, how does this fit in with everything? Is there a comment, or will it be discussed at budget time?
I don't know. We've had a councillor up there. You want to speak to it, Dave, or can you? Sure.
And thank you, Mr. Mayor. And Jane, you can certainly jump in anytime you feel like it. But the Airport Committee has a fund of their own in addition to the funds that are provided by council. So we will be looking at their annual funding in our budget deliberations, certainly. But these three projects are in a co-pay, and I would say majority pay by the airport funds of their own.
Any further comments? All in favor then? Opposed, if any? That's carried. The next item is motions, and this one is to do with encroachment. It's been moved by Councillor Dave Myatt, seconded by Councillor Mike Myatt, that whereas the current policy regarding application for encroachments onto municipally owned property is very restrictive with few exceptions being granted, and whereas in certain circumstances the granting of an encroachment for matters of safety, beautification, or matters otherwise of mutual benefit to the municipality and property owner may be considered, and whereas such encroachments would not result in increased liability to the municipality, changes to the property boundary, decreased safety, obscure road visibility, or encumbrances to carry out municipal work duties, And whereas there are numerous non-approved encroachments existing on which have been made without permission of the municipality with little or no recourse, thus forcing property owners to take the forgiveness over permission route of action. Therefore, be it resolved that staff be directed to review the current policy for encroachment applications onto municipal road allowances, right-of-ways, or other such land adjacent to private property, such that permits would be allowed under certain specific and mutually beneficial circumstances, and that staff report back to Council with recommendations on how the policy can be amended to reflect the current reality, and to make decisions on encroachments where such decisions are in the mutual interest of the municipality, the property owner, and or for safety reasons. Comments or questions?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As the mover of this, I'd like to just maybe give a little bit of background as to what's driving it, and without going into any specific instances or examples. It's just the current policy, as I've stated in the motion, is restrictive to the point where people are sometimes making the decision to do things under the cover of weather or darkness or without getting the proper approvals, because the experience has been that when they ask for an approval with very few exceptions, the approvals are not granted. And in addition to that, this policy, like any policy, I think from time to time should be reviewed for its application, for its applicability, for its currentness in our municipality. I think that the current policy was probably adopted from one of the former prior to amalgamation policies, and so it's well time that is reviewed. And it just so happens that in our last meeting today at Committee of the Whole, we had an example provided to us, an attachment to the petition that, in fact, has a similar bylaw that was passed by the city of Wasaga Beach that talks about many of the things that we're talking about here, because it seems that they've taken on this very subject themselves and were able to come up with some recommendations that meet the needs of the citizens and at the same time meet the needs of the municipality to be able to limit their liability, carry out their duties, and without giving up any sort of boundaries or things like that. So that is my reasoning for putting this forward, and I'm hoping that staff will be able to give it a thorough review and come back with recommendations that envision or that will allow us to make exceptions where exceptions make sense, instead of those that don't ask permission getting away with it, and the ones that do having to be held accountable. Thank you.
Other comments? Councillor Mike Myatt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I did second the motion, and I do obviously support it. I think that it's not a bad thing to review our policies from time to time. I don't think our encroachment policy has been reviewed for a very long time. Staff might very well come back and with a recommendation. We do nothing. It's still black and white in terms of there are just simply no encroachments on our waterfront. That may be the case. On the other hand, they may come back and say, you know what, there's a couple things here that we may be able to exercise some flexibility when someone comes forth with an encroachment request. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to keep on top of reviews of our policies from time to time. And as you say, we may end up doing nothing, but I think perhaps maybe there is a little bit of room for some flexibility. I know it can be a little dangerous with opening the door to encroachments on our waterfront, because it could be that domino effect. But I think we've got very capable staff that can come back with recommendations and talk about what we maybe can and or cannot do. And so I support the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm a little bit confused by the assertion that we haven't reviewed this policy. It was only in April that staff came to us with a recommendation on the policy, and included in that recommendation was a reaffirmation of the current approach to encroachments, which Council voted to do. Council only earlier this year, a couple months ago, reaffirmed that the staff should continue to limit encroachments wherever possible. So, I mean, it isn't, I just don't think it's entirely factual that we haven't reviewed the approach we have and reaffirmed the current approach. I'm a little confused by the motion, to be honest. It asks for a review, but it asks for a review and dictates what the outcome of the review should be, and that permits would be allowed under certain specific and mutually beneficial circumstances. And that's really the current policy. I mean, encroachments are supposed to be allowed when necessary, not nice to have. I mean, that's the wording that I've heard from the administration. And it's granted, absolutely true, that very few have been granted since amalgamation. Only 10 where we have encroachment agreements since that time. And some of those recognize existing structures. Some of them were for new structures. But the structure is a good one. Municipal property is not municipal property, it's public property. The current process requires staff to only support an encroachment where it's necessary from a construction standpoint or an operational standpoint, and where it's nice to have, they reject it, and the applicant has the opportunity to come to council. And council gets to decide what happens to public land, as it should be. In every case, council should decide what happens to public land, because that's probably the core thing that we're entrusted with, is protecting the public's land. So, and that's what happened. It just happened in April. Again, staff rejected what they viewed to be a nice-to-have encroachment. It came to council, and council supported staff. That was the vote. I chaired the meeting. I remember it. So, to me, I guess I'm confused by the recommendation, and I think that any revision we make to the policy is only going to soften the approach. It's going to hand control over to our staff or the administration or somebody else to make decisions about when public land should be used. And we know from our personal experience here, very recently, just earlier this meeting and before, that encroachments on public land, when they're permitted, they can last a long time, and the longer they last and the longer they go on, the less control we have over that land. We can eventually lose that land without making any decision at all, but to allow an encroachment. We've seen it happen. It can happen. So council bears that responsibility today under the current policy. Council must make the decision whether or not to allow people to have encroachments over our land. Council should continue to have that control. And I think the present policy works fine in order to make sure that that happens. So I don't support any change. And I could support a review, I suppose, but this motion doesn't ask for a review. It goes beyond review. It asks for a review and says what the outcome should be. And I don't agree that there should be any change to the policy, so I can't really support the motion. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Luke. Other comments? Councilor Minaj.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Then, with your permission, I'd like to ask the Deputy Mayor if he would explain how we would get out of this conundrum where the original work was done and we didn't support it, staff didn't support it, and we agreed with staff, and then after further review, the neighbors came back and they said, the residents came back and they said, could we please have a stairway to move from the top of our property to the bottom of the property that goes across, the top of municipal public owned property to the bottom of the property so that they could easily access the plantations that they had put in, and they could access the waterfront. And at that point, we were looking for a methodology that supported that request as opposed to a no. So if this isn't the way, this is the way I viewed it, if this isn't the way to do it, then can you, Deputy Mayor Luke, please guide us then on how we should be able to do this such that staff can make those deliberations if it's a reasonable request, that they don't all have to come to council on an individual basis.
Well, thanks for the question, Councilor Minaj. I think that I think, and I'll come back to the basic point, I think council must have the ultimate authority over making these decisions, and council has in the past permitted encroachments. I remember with the Allen's Fireside Grill example, there was a prime example where it was not something that staff could believe that they could grant from an absolutely necessary standpoint. It came to council, and council decided to approve the encroachment from an economic development standpoint. Council can use whatever criteria it wants to use to approve encroachments. Council has the ultimate authority. If council looks at the circumstances and decides an encroachment makes sense for whatever reason, it doesn't matter what reason, council can decide for no reason at all, but council gets to decide. And I guess I don't remember it turning out the way that you suggested with the previous example. My recollection was that we saw what was presented as a possible encroachment, and council rejected it. And I don't remember council asking for a lot of information about what to do. I think council just turned it down, and it didn't have to give reasons. We are the stewards of the public land, and we can decide and ought to decide what ought to become of it. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
One more time, Councillor Dave Myatt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As I started out by saying, I didn't want to get into any specific examples of where there may or may not have been encroachments asked for or granted, but perhaps I'll start off by saying also that I agree that council should be as the representatives of the people, the ones that decide what happens with municipal land. So I wholeheartedly agree with the deputy mayor to that point, and it may just be that the results of the recommendation that comes back from staff would be that if there are encroachments that are requested that fit into a broader spectrum of what is allowable than currently exists, that any of those recommendations may come to council the same way that divisions of land or land use or things that are outside of the plan and that are done through the planning committee come to council for final blessing, that we should ultimately be the ones that say yay or nay to things that happen on municipal land. But the definitions currently as they exist are so restrictive that even we, when faced with a decision at council about an encroachment, are forced to abide by the law, the policy itself, which, as you stated quite correctly, is necessary as opposed to nice to have. So we as a council made a decision earlier this year, as you pointed out, and there have been decisions made in the past by previous councils that were based on necessary as opposed to nice to have. And I would think that what I'm trying to accomplish with this motion is that the spectrum of what is necessary could be expanded, or what would be nice to have could be even included into a possible encroachment in the allowable form. But I agree wholeheartedly that we should never relinquish the decision-making portion of that to be this body. Thank you.
John?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I tend to agree with the Deputy Mayor on almost everything about this. There's a number of things. I hate that when someone breaks the law, that you change the law to accommodate the people that have broke the law instead of enforcing the law that's in place. So my hope would be that if it does go for review, that we do not broaden the scope very, very much. I like having a very restrictive encroachment policy and then giving us the final say. So I think there's the part in there that talks about people who have, tried to get grandfathered in or under the cloak of the dark, as Councillor Myatt said. I believe that we should stick with a policy that restricts and allows people to come forward with what they think is a reasonable request. And if it is a reasonable request, I believe that we'll grant it at that time.
I'm going to let her speak first, so everybody gets one chance first. Okay, Councillor Grace.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm wondering if the sponsors of the motion would consider just limiting this to a review? Because I think when we discussed this in April, I didn't really consider that a review in my definition of review, in terms of looking at maybe a history of not really specifically, but how many encroachments do we experience, how many situations. I mean, I talked to some people last year during the election campaign who had, similar examples of people sort of being punished for coming forward to ask for like a minor revision on their home. That this is like an old historic cottage that is encroaching on a road allowance that, it ended up that they were being, I think, unfairly punished, and they could look around and see lots of other people in their neighborhood who had done similar things over the years and hadn't come forward and somehow were getting away with it. So I guess what I'm saying is that I would really support looking at this in a broader way, looking at some background, some history, and that's what I would, I'd support that if that's what the motion was driving towards. Thanks.
Councillor Mike Myatt.
Mr. Mayor, and our Deputy Mayor corrected me when I said it was been a long time since we reviewed our encroachment policy, and I went through both sets of minutes in April just as people were talking. I either slept through the meeting, which I don't usually do, I'm pretty attentive, or I've really missed something about an in-depth review of our encroachment policy, because I sure don't recollect at all having a very long discussion about our encroachment policy and what are some of the potential changes, and ask staff to review the policy. So again, I either slept through the meeting, which I usually don't, and pretty attentive. I can't find where we did an in-depth review. So I still support the motion, Mr. Mayor. I just want to say I still support the motion that it's a review. And I think reviewing our policies at any time is not a bad thing to look at the way we conduct our business. So I do support the motion.
Okay. Vice Deputy Mayor Huber.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't be supporting this as it's written because, again, it's very directive at the end. I believe that we've done a very good job over the last number of years with addressing some challenges with encroachments when we've had opportunities through the Planning Advisory Committee, or when there's been applications for building permits and there's encroachments. There's been an awful lot of work done there that, I think that this is being driven by one particular example that's just been before us recently, and it's very much on the radar at the moment, but there's a whole lot of work that's gone on to get us to this point, and I can't support this because the implied thing in this motion is that we would make it easier for people or possible for people to do this, to build or erect things on public property when we've been doing such a great job at limiting it, questioning it, challenging it when it happens, or stopping it before it happens. And I like that, if somebody really wants to make it a point, they can come before us. I think if we reviewed the policy ourselves, we'd realize that there is an opportunity in there to do some things when they're necessary. Yeah, you got to ask permission, but there's a way that someone can follow through. Unfortunately, yes, a lot of people just do things and don't ask, but we're getting better at that, so I won't be supporting this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Once more, John, go ahead, sir.
I would just ask if the mover and the seconder of the motion, as Councillor Grace had recommended, would be able to cut off the last bit of that motion and just say, therefore be it resolved that staff be directed to review the current policy.
Mr. Mayor, as the mover, I would accept a revision to the motion that would end it at onto municipal road allowances, right-of-ways, and other such land adjacent to private property. Is that where you see it ending, at private property? Put a period? Or encroachments? Yes, I would allow that revision to, or amendment to the motion.
First of all, I think the policy that we have now is almost too lenient, because I would almost never allow an encroachment, almost never. And I know the Waterfront Plan talks about, and the long-term encroachment should disappear. I think too often they're used for special access and trying to limit public access to public property. And I know there is lots of them out there, and you just simply can't be on top of all of them. It would be nice if we could, but I think Luke spoke to it very elegantly. They're trustees of this public property here for all of the people, and I think we need to protect it that way. So I have, I'm torn, and I probably will vote to support the motion, but I would ask the staff to come back, if they do, with some legal opinions and find a more restrictive way. That's my opinion, because I do not support encroachments almost ever. So, with that, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? That carries. So there's the next item on the agenda is that notice of motion. You have a copy of it, and it'll be on our next agenda. So the next item is bylaws, and we have two bylaws. In the first, I believe two, yeah? Two, and the first one was moved by Councillor Grace, seconded by Councillor Dave Mayette. That bylaw 78-2015, being a bylaw to authorize the acquisition of land, is hereby read a first, second, and third time, and finally passed and sealed this 28th day of September 2015. Any questions or comments? Bylaw or motion? All in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. The next item is the repeal of bylaw, and there's a report with it that's repeal bylaw 34-2014, appointment of a director of finance, and it's been moved by Councillor Rich, seconded by Deputy Mayor Charbonneau. That bylaw 79-2015, being a bylaw to repeal bylaw 34-2014, appointing a director of finance for the corporation of the town of Saugeen Shores, is hereby read a first, second, and third time, and finally passed and sealed this 28th day of September 2015. Questions or comments? Councillor Madison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Will there be any exit interview with Kate to go over position reasons and all that stuff? Why she's leaving?
Councillor Minaj.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would like to think that it's more appropriate that staff will not keep council apprised as recruitment steps are initiated and proceed in the near future. I would think it would be more appropriate that we would at least get the draft report from the organizational review before any next steps are taken. It may be that such that a director of finance is not what the new organization is recommending.
Mr. Mayor, I've spoken to the consultants on that very topic and received confirmation late last week they are not contemplating any major changes to the finance area of the organization, and they are encouraging us to get on with the replacement as soon as possible.
So as we went through the emergency management review, the plan, we recognized that there's supposed to be a replacement for the CAO that's well versed in all the machinations of conducting an emergency plan. So those requirements currently listed in the job duties of a chief financial officer.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, I'm not certain at this point, if they are or are not.
In any case, we will have an alternate for that position if we need. If Councillor Mike or Dave Mayette.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. With respect to the replacement for the Director of Finance, and we had a small conversation about this earlier, but I think it prudent that because it was so recent that we recruited for the current or the exiting director, that we should go back to that list and see if any of the top candidates are in fact still interested or available.
Mr. Mayor, yes, we did have a short list that we selected from last time, and we will certainly be following up with those individuals.
Any further questions? All in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. And the final item, or the next item, is a confirmatory bylaw. It's been moved by Councillor Rich, seconded by Deputy Mayor Charbonneau, that bylaw 80-2015, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the Council of the Town of Saugeen Shores, is hereby read a first, second, and third time and finally passed and sealed this 28th day of September 2015. All in favor? That's carried. And it's been moved by Councillor Huber and seconded by Councillor Grace that this regular council meeting of September the 28th, 2015 hereby adjourned at 9:45. All in favor? We're adjourned.